Hello and welcome to English with Chris. In today's lesson, we're going to have a look at a grammar topic that many of my students find very challenging, and these are sentences that use the word if. Like, if it's sunny, I will go to the beach. These are called conditionals, as I'm sure many of you know. There are a few different types of them, and the grammar can be quite tricky and challenging to get right. So we're going to have a look at them all, look at some examples, do some exercises like normal, and by the end of the lesson, you'll be able to use them perfectly, hopefully. Firstly, I'd just like to start with a quick explanation about the difference between the words when and if. I hear these words mixed up daily by many of my students, and they don't understand how to use them properly. So we use when something is certain, when something is certain to happen in the future, like when the sun rises tomorrow, I will get up from bed. And when something certainly did happen in the past, like when I was a child, I lived in England. However, we use if when we're not sure whether something will happen or not. And this is why we have to use conditionals. So there are three main types of conditionals, which we will get onto in a moment. But I just want to start by explaining what we call the zero conditional. And this is for things that are always true. And that's why in this conditional, we usually use the word when. For example, when the sun rises, it gets warmer. Or when Chris is sick, we don't have a lesson. And in these types of conditionals, we always follow when with the present simple. And in the second clause of the sentence, we also have the present simple. Now moving on to the first conditional. So the form of this conditional is if, followed by the present simple, and then in the second clause of the sentence, you have will, followed by your verb in the first form. For example, if I watch Chris's lessons, I will improve my English. We use this conditional to talk about real and likely situations. So things that happen in everyday life. If your friend calls you, do you want to come out and go to the pub? You'll say, if I feel okay, I will come to the pub, things like that. A good way to practice these, as I always say, is through repetition. So you can make up a little story in your head and just keep repeating it, and then the grammar and the form of the conditionals will just become natural for you. For example, as I said before, if I watch Chris's lessons, I will improve my English. And if I improve my English, I will become more fluent. And if I become more fluent, I will get a better job. And if I get a better job, I will have more money. And if I have more money, I will buy a bigger house. And if I have a big house, I will have a big family. And if I have a big family, I will be happy. So in effect, by watching my lessons, you will have a good job, you will have lots of money and a big family, and you'll be very happy. Simple. So now we'll move on to the second conditional. And the form of the second conditional is if plus past tense. And then in the second clause of the sentence, you have would plus the verb in the first form. For example, if I were president, I would abolish taxes. And unlike the first conditional, which we use for real and likely situations, with the second conditional, we use this for unlikely and hypothetical situations. So it's often used in these crazy hypothetical scenarios like, if I could fly, I would fly to the moon, or if I was famous, I would be a footballer. However, it can also be used for everyday things, just to express that you think it's a bit less likely that this thing will happen. For example, if you have a job interview and you're really confident about the job interview and you think you're going to get the job, you might say something like, if I get this job, I will be over the moon. But if you're not very confident about it and you don't think you're going to get it, you might say something like, if I got this job, I would be so happy, or if I got this job, I would be on top of the world. And again, the best way to practice this is by repetition, repeating the sentences over and over until they become natural for you. So you can make up a little story like we did for the first conditional, Or you can think about some hypothetical questions and how you would answer them. For example, what would you do if you won the lotto? You can have a little think about that and how you would answer that now. If I won the lotto, I would move to an exotic island. Or if you could be invisible for a day, what would you do? If I could be invisible for a day, I would see what my students really think of me. Or if you had a time machine, where or when would you travel to? If I had a time machine, I would travel 1,000 years into the future to see if people were still watching my lessons. And it seems like my dog is still watching my lessons. So the first two conditionals are used to talk about the present to the future. They're not used to talk about the past, which is a common mistake I hear with the second conditional because it uses a past tense, but it is not used to talk about the past. If you want to use a conditional to describe the past, then you have to use the third conditional. The third conditional is not as common as the first two, and the grammar is much more difficult. However, it is useful to know in order to be able to speak about the past and to speak retrospectively about a decision that you made that you would have made differently had you done something else. So imagine that you studied economics at university in the past, but you're thinking about what you could have done differently. So you can use a third conditional for this. You might say something like, if I hadn't studied economics, I would have studied law. If I had studied harder, I would have got a better job. So the form of the third conditional is if plus had plus the third form of the verb, which is the past perfect. And in the second clause, you have would plus have plus the third form of the verb, which is the present perfect. So it's if plus past perfect, and then would plus present perfect. I know that sounds very complicated, but when you begin to use it in practice, it's much simpler. You don't always have to think in your head, oh, what tense, past perfect, present perfect. So to practice this, I'm going to ask you some questions about big decisions that might have happened in your past and what you could have done differently. So if you hadn't studied English, what would you have studied? If I hadn't studied English, I would have had big problems because I was brought up and raised in England. But for me, I would say if I hadn't studied French at school, I would have studied Spanish. The next question to practice this is, if you hadn't got a job, what would you have done? If I hadn't got a job, I would have traveled more. And finally, this might not apply to everybody, but if you hadn't stayed in your home country, where would you have moved to? For me, I didn't stay in my home country. I actually live in Prague now. So if I hadn't moved to Prague, maybe I would have moved to somewhere in South America. It's important to know that there are also mixed conditionals, and this is when you combine the second and the third conditional. For example, you can say something like, if I had studied medicine, I would be a doctor now. So this expresses the present result of a different past event or a different past action. I don't want to go too much into the grammar on this. I just want to let you know that it is possible to do this. These conditionals are not completely rigid. You can mix them up a bit. I'll probably do a different video in the future on mixed conditionals, because this is if you get to a much more advanced level, you can start incorporating these into your vocabulary. But for now, in order not to confuse you too much, I think it's best to stick to these three main conditionals to start to understand them. And then when you have a good grasp of these, then you can begin to move on to mixed conditionals. And as usual, now for the practical interactive part of the lesson, I'm going to give you some incorrect sentences relating to any of the conditionals that we've looked at today. And I'd like you to try to find the mistake and then correct the sentences to make them perfect. So my first incorrect sentence is, if I go to the party, I would get drunk. You can pause the video now, have a little think about it. So the correct version of this should be, if I went to the party, I would get drunk, hypothetically. Or you can say, if I go to the party, I will get drunk. If you're a bit more sure that this will happen. My second incorrect sentence is, if I had slept more, I would have been so tired. Again, you can pause the video, have a little think. So this was more a mistake of context. The actual grammar of the sentence was right. However, it doesn't make sense to say, I would have been tired if I had slept more. You should say, if I had slept more, I wouldn't have been so tired. My next incorrect sentence is, when I got the job, I would be happy. So the mistake here is using when. You should say, if I got the job, I would be happy. Talking about the future, obviously. And my last incorrect sentence is, if I more study, I will more learn. This is a mistake of word order. It should be, if I study more, I will learn more. And that concludes my lesson on conditionals for today. If you liked the video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. There should be a new lesson every week for you. And I'll look forward to seeing you again. Cheers.